Look, good morning. My name's Paddy Nixon, and I'm here to speak this morning with Michelle Grattan about a week in politics. Good morning, Michelle.
Hi, Paddy.
Well, a fascinating week. The last sitting day of the fortnight was yesterday, a sitting that was almost jeopardised, of course, by the Canberra lockdown, which is why we're on video today rather than in person. With a long break now and only 4 sitting weeks before the end of the year, when Parliament comes back in late October, it's hard to say what the state of lockdown is going to be across Australia and whether our vaccination targets will be met. In fact, whether we'll be meeting in person, Michelle.
Well, that's right. I think that we're in actually for a few very bad weeks. Numbers are going up in New South Wales and Victoria in recent days. They've been increasing, and there's been a sharp rise this morning in Victoria. We've still got to get New South Wales's figures, but basically those states are in a very bad way. And of course, as you say, we're locked down here in the ACT, not a critical number of cases, but not a great prospect anywhere, frankly. And we're seeing now a debate opening up about whether the hospital system can cope when the states start to open. The Prime Minister is very, very determined to get the country open as quickly as feasible. And New South Wales also wants to do that. But it's going to be rough on the health front. And of course, you have this very acrimonious debate within the Federation now, really, I think, as toxic as it has been at any point, and probably more so with Queensland and New South Wales making it very clear they're not going to be dictated to by any firm timetable and shots firing in every direction in terms of the rhetoric.
Yeah, and in fact, I think New South Wales and Victoria have now conceded that they won't get to COVID zero, or in fact anywhere near zero, and the focus is on limiting the inevitable increase. And this is pretty disheartening, isn't it, for Victorians and New South Wales and for Australians?
Well, it is disheartening. I think the other factor is there's a lot of frustration, though, with the lockdowns in those states. People are really at the end of their tether, homeschooling and coping with working from home. We've spoken about this before, but it's just got worse since. And in terms of Victoria, they, of course, had hoped that they could get this outbreak under control and that COVID zero or near zero was possible again. And I think their concession this week, Dan Andrews' concession, was very significant and a real turning point in this pandemic. And of course, we are now in a big third wave of this pandemic. In Australia, we had the second wave in Victoria last year. This is now the third wave. It's deepening at the same time as the federal government in particular is determined to get us back to normal as quickly as possible. Just in terms of the numbers, the predictions I was getting yesterday were that the Victorian outbreak was likely to be more than 1,000 cases a day, new cases, later this month. And the New South Wales outbreak was likely to reach 3,000 to 4,000 new cases daily late in the month. So that just shows you the way this crisis is escalating.
And then, as you just mentioned, of course, there's this rift between Western Australia, Queensland, and to some extent the rest of Australia. Is there any issues for the Federation as a whole?
Undoubtedly, it's putting strains on the Federation at the moment. The National Cabinet, of course, has worked quite well at various stages of this crisis, but there's always been some division within it. It's never been completely united across the board on issues, but now we are seeing serious fractures among the states. And I think this has been worsened by the fact that we are running up to a federal election, and that's very much in the federal government's mind.
And then on Thursday, Greg Hunt came out and then said the pandemic has become endemic. So it's just going to be part and parcel of life. Is this the next stage in combating the virus? And is the government trying to change the narrative, do you think?
Well, once you concede you can't get back near to COVID zero, then the logic of this is that it's endemic in the community. We have to live with it. That has big consequences in terms of vaccination rates and of course, hospitalisations and deaths. So National Cabinet today is discussing the hospital system. There's debate over whether the vaccination levels of 70 to 80% are going to be adequate for reopening. In particular, there are vulnerable sections of the community, like, for example, Indigenous people, like some people in poorer socioeconomic areas who mightn't reach those vaccination levels and are particularly vulnerable for other reasons. So once you're talking about this being endemic in the community, and I suppose it was always likely to reach this point, but it does change the conversation into the question of risks. On the other hand, the Prime Minister is trying to change the conversation in the other direction. He wants to talk about hope, about getting back to normal, about how things will be when we open up, when we are back to one country in terms of borders coming down, and of course, ultimately, the international border being opened up.
On Wednesday of this week, the national accounts were released, and they were showing economic growth rose in the June quarter, ahead of when the New South Wales lockdown began on the 26th. But in light of lockdowns, what can we expect in the September quarter?
The September quarter will be bad, will be negative, and the Treasurer has already acknowledged this. Government was very relieved that those June figures were positive, because there were some fears they might be negative, which would have meant that we were definitely going to be in recession. The question will now be the December quarter, and no one's quite sure whether that will be positive or negative. If it's negative, then we would be in technical recession with 2 quarters running negative growth, but the government's still hoping that that December quarter might be positive.
And then just as a final question, the government recently lost a case about National Cabinet confidentiality, but is now seeking to achieve the same aims through legislation. Is the government trying to avoid the transparency and accountability?
Absolutely, and this is very much the way the Morrison government plays things. It is not committed to transparency at all. If it can get away with not being transparent, I think that the National Cabinet ought to be more transparent. It's not a real cabinet, as the legal judgment found, and that especially relating to this period through the pandemic, we should have access to maximum information. It wouldn't be a complete free-for-all. There'd be guidelines around what would be released under freedom of information, but I think it's reprehensible that the government is trying to take this step to, as it were, get around that adverse court decision.
Well, look, Michelle, thank you very much. That's been fascinating as always. I'm not expecting it to be quiet now between the end of October. I suspect we'll have some really challenging conversations to have over the next couple of months.
I think we will. There's certainly challenging times.
Yes, indeed. Look, goodbye, and I look forward to speaking to you again.
Thanks, Paddy.